Alejandro Mendoza never imagined that returning home 3 hours earlier than planned would change his life forever. Spain's most powerful billionaire quietly opened the door to his Madrid mansion, expecting to find the perfect silence that always reigned in his home. Instead, from the upper floor, he heard a sweet voice singing a lullaby. He climbed the stairs quietly and stopped at the threshold of his bedroom, paralyzed by what he saw. The maid Carmen was helping her elderly father, who was suffering from Alzheimer's, to go to bed with infinite tenderness. The man he had thought dead for years was there, fragile and confused, cared for by the daughter who had sacrificed everything for him. At that moment, Alejandro realized that the woman who had worked in his house for 6 months was hiding a secret that would break the hardest heart, and that his life of luxury and solitude was about to be shattered by a discovery that would teach him the true meaning of love. Alejandro Mendoza hung up the phone with a curt gesture, interrupting the video conference with the New York executives. At 42, he was used to controlling every detail of his financial empire. But that afternoon the meeting had ended earlier than planned. It was 8 p.m., and normally he wouldn't have returned home until 11 a.m. He drove his Maserati through the streets of Madrid toward the mansion in the Salamanca district, which he had inherited from his grandfather, a 17th-century residence with 20 rooms, perfect gardens, and a silence that in recent years had become his most faithful companion. Alejandro had been living alone since his divorce 3 years ago from a model who was only interested in his money. Since then, he had chosen solitude for simplicity and predictability. The service staff had precise schedules. The cook until 7, the gardener until 6, the maid until 8. After that, the mansion returned to its perfect silence, and Alejandro could devote himself to work. But that evening, as he opened his front door at 8:10, Alejandro heard something he had never heard before, the sound of a human voice sweetly singing a lullaby from the upper floor, melodious and full of love. It stopped in the marble hall, confused. Carmen, the maid, should have left by now. She was a 35-year-old woman, always very reserved and professional, who had been working for him for 6 months. She never spoke about herself. She did her work in silence and disappeared punctually. At 8 o'clock he climbed the marble stairs quietly, guided by that voice that continued singing. The sound was coming from his bedroom, and it alarmed him. He approached the half-open door, and what he saw left him completely motionless. Carmen was leaning over an elderly man lying in his bed, a man in his 70s with white hair and a face marked by age. She was helping him drink from a glass with infinitely delicate gestures, whispering words of comfort in a voice Alejandro had never heard before. The man seemed confused and disoriented, but he allowed himself to be cared for with the docility of a child. He looked at Carmen with eyes that seemed not to fully recognize her, then smiled with a sweetness typical of someone who lives in their own world. Alejandro stood frozen in the doorway. That was Carmen's father. What was he doing in his bed? Why had she never told him about having an elderly father? And above all, why was he hiding it in his house? He watched the tears silently stream down Carmen's cheeks as she tucked the blankets around her father. It was a scene of such pure tenderness that he, accustomed to the cold world of business, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He involuntarily took a step back, and the parquet creaked. Carmen turned sharply, her face turning pale as a leaf when she saw Alejandro in the doorway. Alejandro looked into her eyes, then looked at the old man who had fallen asleep peacefully in the bed. At that moment, he realized he was about to discover a story that would forever change not only how he viewed Carmen, but perhaps himself as well. Carmen trembled as she followed Alejandro into the main living room, leaving the father sleeping peacefully in the bedroom. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He had prepared 1,000 excuses and explanations, but now that he had arrived, he felt completely vulnerable. Alejandro sat down in the leather chair and invited her to sit opposite him. For the first time in 6 months, he really looked at her, not as the invisible maid who cleaned his house, but as a person with a story, with pain and secrets. Carmen was 35 years old, but that afternoon she looked 10 years older. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple bun. Her face was marked by fatigue. Her hands were battered by work, but she had intelligent and gentle eyes. And Alexander realized that he had never noticed how beautiful she was in her simplicity. The story Carmen began to tell was more tragic than Alejandro had imagined. Her father, Roberto Herrera, had been a highly respected literature professor, a cultured and spirited man who had raised Carmen alone after the death of his wife. 2 years earlier, he had begun to show the first signs of Alzheimer's, a disease that had progressed rapidly. At first it was just a few forgetfulnesses. Then it got worse. Carmen had had to leave her job as a teacher to care for him full-time. The savings ran out in a few months. The family home was sold to pay for medical treatment, and in the end they were left with nothing. Nursing homes for Alzheimer's patients cost €3,000 a month, an impossible figure for Carmen. The public schools had waiting lists that were years long, and his father couldn't wait. She had looked for work everywhere, but no one wanted to hire someone who had to care for a sick person until she found the advertisement for a housekeeper position at the Mendoza mansion. The idea of hiding the father in the employer's house was desperate, but it was the only solution. During the day, he stayed in the humble boarding house where they lived on the outskirts, but at night he became agitated and confused. If I took him to the silent mansion, he slept better. He would take him at dawn before Alejandro returned from work. Alejandro looked at her incredulously as she explained her secret routine. If she had been discovered earlier, she would have been fired and arrested. But his father was dying, losing a piece of himself every day. All I could do was make these last few months as sweet as possible. The tears that Carmen had held back for months began to fall freely. Alejandro saw her cry and felt something break inside him. That woman was fighting an invisible enemy, dedicating her life to a man who probably didn't even acknowledge her every day. When Alejandro asked why she hadn't told him, Carmen responded with a truth that struck him deeply. To him, she was just the woman who cleaned his house. Why would he care about your problems? In 6 months, he had never asked her a personal question, never shown interest in her life. From the upper floor came a confused voice calling Carmen's name. The old man had woken up in a place he didn't recognize and was getting scared. Carmen jumped up to go with him, and Alejandro stopped her with a gesture saying that he needed to think. While Carmen ran up the stairs, Alejandro remained in the dark living room staring at the ceiling. In 42 years of life, I had always thought that love was a weakness, a distraction from true goals. But that afternoon he had seen something that had shown him a kind of strength he had never known before, that of someone willing to sacrifice everything to protect the one he loves. And for the first time in years, Alejandro Mendoza felt small and alone in his 20-room mansion. Alejandro couldn't sleep that night. He remained in his study, looking at the financial documents without reading them, his mind continually returning to the scene he had seen. From the upper floor, occasionally came whispers, the sound of light footsteps, the sound of a comforting voice. Around 3 a.m., driven by a curiosity he couldn't control, he silently climbed the stairs. The door to his bedroom was ajar, and through the crack he saw a scene that would remain etched in his heart forever. Carmen was sitting in a chair next to the bed, watching over her father's sleep. He held a book of poems in his hands and read in a low voice, even though the man was asleep. Occasionally, he would get up to adjust the blankets or gently touch her forehead, checking for a fever. Alejandro saw the clock on the bedside table. It was 3:20. Carmen had been there for 7 hours and would probably stay until dawn. The next day, I would have to be back at work at 8 pretending like nothing had happened. He returned to his study with a question hammering in his head. When was the last time someone watched over your sleep? When was the last time someone had cared for him with such total dedication? At dawn, Alejandro heard movement upstairs, looked out the window, and saw Carmen helping her father get into an old seat. The man seemed confused but docile, and she spoke to him with infinite patience, explaining that they were going home. The car drove off into the Madrid morning fog, and Alejandro stood at the window wondering where they would live, what their home would be like, if Carmen would really be able to take care of her father on her own. At 8 o'clock sharp, Carmen rang the doorbell like every morning. Alejandro greeted her personally, something he had never done before. Her face looked tired, but she tried to hide it behind her usual professional smile. How did he manage to look so normal after a sleepless night? How did he manage to hide all that suffering behind a mask of efficiency? Alejandro told her they needed to talk, and she prepared for the dismissal she thought was inevitable. Instead, he made a decision that surprised him. I didn't want to fire her, I wanted to help her. Alejandro had never made a spontaneous gesture of generosity in his life. Each of his donations had been calculated for tax benefits or public image. But that morning, looking at that woman struggling with a dignity he had never possessed, he made the most humane decision of his life. His father could stay there. I would fix up one of the guest rooms downstairs. He would hire a nurse to help her, and she would continue working, but with a schedule that would allow her to be close to him. Carmen burst into tears, not tears of sadness, but of relief so intense that she was lost for words. When asked why he was doing this for her, Alejandro answered with complete sincerity. The previous evening, she had shown him what it really meant to love someone, and he had understood that in that house that was too big and too quiet there was room for a little humanity. As they headed toward the room that would become Carmen's father's new home, Alejandro felt something strange in his chest. For the first time in years, I had made a decision not guided by profit or convenience, but by my heart. And for the first time in years, he felt truly rich. The following weeks transformed the Mendoza mansion into a completely different place. Alejandro had installed everything necessary to make Mr. Roberto's room comfortable. An orthopedic bed, an adapted bathroom, a reclining chair next to the window overlooking the garden. He had also hired Maria, a nurse specializing in Alzheimer's patients, a sweet woman in her 50s. Are you enjoying the story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, we continue with the video. That he looked after Mr. Roberto during the day while Carmen worked, but it was clear that the old man preferred his daughter to anyone else. Alejandro soon discovered that Mr. Roberto's presence had brought life to his home. The man had moments of lucidity in which it was fascinating to talk to him. He had been a brilliant teacher. He knew everything about Spanish literature. And when he was present in his own right, he would tell anecdotes that kept everyone enchanted. One afternoon, while they were in the garden, Mr. Roberto told Alejandro that a man's true wealth is measured by the people who love him, not by the money he has. He added that his daughter was the richest person in the world, even though she didn't have a single euro in the bank. But there were also difficult moments. Some nights, Mr. Roberto would wake up confused and agitated. I didn't recognize where I was. Sometimes I didn't even recognize Carmen. Alejandro heard her screams from his room and watched the lights stay on for hours. One night, driven by an impulse to help, he got up and went to Mr. Roberto's room. She found him sitting on the bed in a panic while Carmen tried to calm him down. The old man didn't know who he was and wanted to go home. Alejandro approached the bed in a calm voice, introducing himself as the owner of the house and explaining that the old man was his guest. Something in her tone calmed Mr. Roberto, who slowly began to recognize Carmen as his daughter. From that night on, Alejandro began to help Carmen in her most difficult moments. He discovered that he had a patience he didn't know he possessed, and an ability to enter Mr. Roberto's confusing world that surprised him. Carmen looked at him with eyes increasingly filled with gratitude, but also with something else that he couldn't define. During the day, while working, they would often stop to talk. She told him memories of her father, what it had been like growing up with a literature teacher, the sacrifices he had made for her. Alejandro, for his part, began to confide things he had never told anyone before, how he felt alone in his successful life, how he had never had a real family, how he was discovering that material wealth filled the emptiness inside him. One afternoon, Mr. Roberto told Carmen that Alejandro reminded him of his grandfather, who had a big house in the country and always welcomed everyone. Perhaps his father saw in Alexander what he could become. At that moment, Alejandro realized that something was happening that went beyond generosity or compassion. He was falling in love with Carmen, with her strength, her dedication, her capacity to love, without asking for anything in return. But he was also falling in love with the idea of family that she and his father represented. For the first time in his life, his home was no longer a place to sleep between work commitments, but a place where there were people he had grown to love. One afternoon, as they watched Mr. Roberto sleep peacefully together, Carmen whispered that she didn't know how to thank him for what he had done for them. Alejandro looked at her and understood that the time had come to tell the truth. It was they who had done something for him. They had been taught what it meant to be a family. The months passed and the mansion's routine consolidated around Mr. Roberto's needs. Alejandro had discovered that changing his life to welcome others was not a sacrifice, but an enrichment. Their work schedules had adapted to the rhythms of the family that had spontaneously been created. Carmen was no longer the invisible employee, but the woman who was becoming the center of his existence. Alejandro watched her as she cared for his father with a dedication that moved him every day. I watched her read to him when he was upset, cook his favorite dishes when he refused to eat, invent little activities to stimulate his memory. Alejandro had begun to take an active part in this family life. In the evening, I had dinner with them. On weekends, she organized short walks in the garden for Mr. Roberto. He had even started reading books of poetry because he had found that they calmed the old man in moments of confusion. One spring Sunday, while the three of them were in the garden, Mr. Roberto had one of his clearest moments of lucidity. She looked at Alejandro and Carmen sitting nearby on the bench and smiled mischievously, asking when they would get married. Carmen blushed violently and tried to explain that there was nothing between them, but Mr. Roberto interrupted her, saying that he was losing his memory, but he was not blind. I saw them looking at each other like he and Carmen's mother looked at each other. Alejandro felt his heart race. They had never spoken openly about the feelings that were developing between them, but they were evident, even to a man suffering from Alzheimer's. This afternoon, after putting Mr. Roberto to bed, Alejandro and Carmen found themselves alone in the living room. There was a sweet tension in the air made of everything that hadn't been said yet. Alejandro confessed to her that when she and her father came into his life, he was rich but empty. He had everything money could buy, but he had no one to love him for who he was. They had given him a family he didn't know he wanted. He went on to say that he had fallen in love with her strength, with her capacity to love, but he had also fallen in love with what they had become together, a true family. Carmen stood up and approached him, confessing that she had also fallen in love with him, with how he had taken care of her father, how he had transformed that house into a true home, but she was afraid of being just a liability, of having nothing to offer, except a sick father and a complicated life. Alejandro took her hands, explaining that she had offered him the most precious thing in the world. He had taught her what it meant to truly love. He asked her to marry him, to officially become the family they had already become in his heart. The kiss that followed was sweet and full of promise. When they separated, Alejandro added that his father was not a responsibility, but the grandfather he had never had. From the upper floor came the voice of Mr. Roberto, saying, "Finally, I thought they would never tell you." They both realized that the old man was more present than he seemed. A year later, Alejandro and Carmen were married in the mansion's garden by Mr. Roberto, who, in one of his most lucid moments of the period, accompanied his daughter to the altar. It was a simple ceremony with a few close friends, but full of a love that only true families know how to give. Mr. Roberto lived another 2 years surrounded by the love of his daughter and the son-in-law he had learned to consider a son. In recent months, when moments of lucidity became increasingly rare, she continued to smile when she saw Alejandro and Carmen together, as if the love between them was the only thing she could still clearly recognize. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep one December night, he left behind a family that had been formed in love and sacrifice. Alejandro and Carmen mourned him together, but they knew that he had been happy in the last years of his life. On the day of the funeral, Carmen said that her father had united them, even in illness, and had given them the greatest gift. He had taught them what it meant to be a family. 5 years after that afternoon that had changed everything, Alejandro and Carmen were sitting in the mansion's garden, watching their 3-year-old daughter, Ana, playing among the roses that Grandpa Roberto once tended. The little girl had her mother's brown hair and her father's blue eyes, but above all she had inherited the sweetness and sensitivity of the grandfather she had never met, but whom Carmen always told her about. The mansion was still the same, but completely transformed. No longer the silent mausoleum of a lonely man, but a house full of life, laughter, and everyday love. Alejandro had discovered that happiness was not in possessing things, but in sharing them with the right people. Carmen had become much more than the woman he had married. She was his life partner, the mother of his daughter, but also the person who continued to teach him every day. What did it mean to love unconditionally? I had returned to teaching, but only part-time, so I could dedicate time to the family I had so longed for. The room where Mr. Roberto had slept had been transformed into Anna's room, but Alejandro had wanted to keep the armchair where the old man sat to look at the garden. I often found Carmen there with the little girl in her arms, telling her stories about the grandfather who was no longer there, but who was always present in their hearts. That afternoon Carmen thought about that night when Alejandro had discovered her with her father in her bedroom. I had been terrified. I thought it was all over. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything. Alejandro smiled, remembering that night that seemed like a lifetime ago. I thought about how empty it had been before. They came to fill that house. Carmen replied that it hadn't been empty. She had just been waiting for them. Ana ran toward them with a flower she had picked, climbing onto her father's knees with that total confidence that only children know how to have. She asked if Grandpa Roberto had loved her very much. Alejandro replied that he would have loved her very much and that he saw her from heaven, sure that he was proud of the wonderful girl she was. When Ana asked if she looked so good when she played in her garden, Carmen confirmed that Grandpa Roberto lived in all the love that existed in that house. That afternoon, after putting Ana to bed, Alejandro and Carmen remained in the living room looking at the photos they had taken over the years. There were images of Mr. Roberto in his lucid moments, wedding photos, Ana's first photos, moments of everyday life that had become treasures. Alejandro said that shortly before he died, Mr. Roberto had told him that he had become the man he had always hoped he would become, and that he was happy to leave Carmen in the hands of someone who loved her as much as he did. Carmen leaned on her husband's shoulder, feeling once again how lucky she had been. Not only had she found the love of her life, but she had also been able to give her father years of happiness he would never have had otherwise. They got up to go to sleep, stopping by Anna's room, as usual, to give her a good night kiss. The little girl slept peacefully, surrounded by stuffed animals, and with a photo of Grandpa Roberto next to her, which she kissed every night before falling asleep. As they fell asleep in the room that had once been a sick man's hiding place, Alejandro thought about how much his life had changed. Once, wealth was measured in millions of euros. Now I measured it in smiles, hugs, moments of shared happiness. He had discovered that true wealth is not accumulated in banks, but is built day by day in human relationships, and that sometimes it takes the courage of a desperate woman and the illness of an old man to teach a lonely millionaire what it really means to be rich. Mr. Roberto was right. The true wealth of a man is measured by the people who love him. And Alejandro Mendoza, looking at his wife sleeping next to him and listening to his daughters breathing in the next room, knew he was the richest man in the world. Like it. If you believe true love can be born from the most difficult situations, share what moment in the story touched your heart the most. Share to inspire those who still believe in the power of family love. Subscribe for more stories of families created from the heart. Sometimes true wealth knocks at your hidden door in a gesture of love. Sometimes it takes illness to teach us what heart health really means. And sometimes the most beautiful families are born not from blood, but from the choice to love each other every day. Because true love knows no social differences, only the depth of feelings. Oh,